General Winter defeated Napoleon. That's the story we've all heard. Napoleon Bonaparte, the military genius who conquered most of Europe, made one fatal mistake. He invaded Russia in 1812. And then winter came. The snow fell, the temperature dropped, and the Grande Armée froze to death in the Russian wasteland. It's one of history's most famous cautionary tales about hubris and the power of nature. There's just one problem: it's mostly wrong. Don't get me wrong, winter absolutely played a role in the disaster. Soldiers did freeze to death by the thousands. The cold was horrific, but the popular narrative that Napoleon's army was defeated primarily by winter weather fundamentally misunderstands what actually happened during the 1812 Russian campaign. The retreat from Moscow is often painted as a simple story. Napoleon reached Moscow, winter arrived, and his army froze while retreating. But the reality is far more complex, far more interesting, and reveals mistakes that had nothing to do with the weather. Today we're breaking down what really destroyed the Grande Armée, the myths that have persisted for over 200 years, and why blaming General Winter lets Napoleon and his commanders off the hook for catastrophic strategic failures. Let's get into it. The General Winter narrative is compelling because it's dramatic. It gives us a clear villain, nature itself, and it absolves Napoleon of responsibility. After all, how can you blame a military genius for not predicting unusually harsh weather? It makes the disaster seem almost inevitable, an act of God rather than human error. This narrative was heavily promoted by Napoleon himself after his return to France. In his bulletins and later memoirs, he emphasized the unprecedented cold, the early winter, the impossible conditions. His marshals and generals echoed these claims. French propaganda painted the campaign as a heroic struggle against the elements, rather than a catastrophic military failure. And the world believed it. Artists painted dramatic scenes of frozen soldiers struggling through blizzards. Historians wrote about the cruel Russian winter as the primary cause of defeat. The image became fixed in popular consciousness: Napoleon's army, caught unprepared by early winter, freezing in the snow. But here's what the records actually show. The campaign was already a disaster before winter truly set in. Napoleon invaded Russia on June 24, 1812, with approximately 685,000 men, the largest army Europe had ever seen. This massive force, the Grande Armée, included French troops, Germans, Poles, Italians, Dutch, and contingents from virtually every nation Napoleon dominated. It was supposed to be an unstoppable juggernaut. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow in mid-September, he had only about 100,000 combat-effective troops remaining. Let that sink in. He'd lost roughly 500,000 men before winter ever became a factor, before the famous retreat through the snow, before the ice and the blizzards. What happened to those men? They didn't freeze. They died of disease, starvation, exhaustion, desertion, and combat. The majority of Napoleon's army was destroyed during the summer and fall in decent weather, while advancing into Russia. The temperature records for 1812 show that while winter did arrive, and was indeed harsh, it wasn't unusually early or unusually severe by Russian standards. The real cold, the killing cold, didn't hit until November and December. By that point, the army was already shattered. So if winter didn't destroy Napoleon's army, what did? The answer reveals a series of catastrophic strategic and logistical failures that are far more instructive than simply blaming the weather. The actual destroyer of the Grande Armée was something far less dramatic than winter. Logistics, supply lines, food, fodder for horses, replacement boots, the boring, unglamorous work of keeping an army fed and equipped. Napoleon was a brilliant tactician and a revolutionary military thinker, but in 1812 he made catastrophic logistical errors that doomed his campaign from the very start. The problem began with the sheer size of the invasion force. 685,000 men is an almost incomprehensible number for early 19th century logistics. That's 685,000 mouths to feed every single day. In 1812, before railroads, before motor transport, before modern canning and food preservation, How do you feed that many men deep in enemy territory? The answer: you can't. Not effectively, not for long. Napoleon's plan was based on the concept of living off the land. The army would forage from the Russian countryside as it advanced. This had worked in his previous campaigns in Central Europe. In Germany, Italy, and Poland, the Grande Armée had been able to requisition food from local populations and survive, even thrive, on foraging. But Russia wasn't Germany. The population density was far lower, the agricultural infrastructure was less developed, the distances were vastly greater, towns were farther apart, and critically, the Russians implemented a scorched earth policy. As they retreated, they destroyed crops, burned villages, and evacuated populations. There was nothing left to forage. Napoleon had attempted to prepare for this. He organized supply trains with thousands of wagons carrying food, ammunition, and equipment. But the logistics were impossibly complex. The Russian roads, such as they were terrible. Often they were just dirt tracks that turned to mud in rain. Wagons broke down, horses died, supply columns fell behind the advancing army. Within weeks of crossing into Russia, supply problems were critical. Soldiers were on reduced rations. Horses were starving. The army had been promised 3 days' rations at all times. Often they had less than 1 day's food. Soldiers began slaughtering their horses for meat, which meant there were fewer horses to pull wagons and artillery, which meant more equipment had to be abandoned, which weakened the army further. It was a death spiral. Disease was rampant. When armies are hungry, when they drink from contaminated water sources, when they can't maintain basic hygiene, disease spreads like wildfire. Dysentery, typhus, and various fevers killed tens of thousands. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. There weren't enough medical supplies, and there was no way to evacuate the sick. Desertion was constant. Soldiers, facing starvation and disease, simply left. They wandered off in search of food. Some tried to make it back to Poland or Germany. Many died along the way or were killed by Russian partisans. Entire units melted away without ever seeing combat. By the time the Grande Armée reached Smolensk in mid-August, still more than 200 miles from Moscow, Napoleon had lost nearly half his force. Not to winter, not even primarily to combat, to logistics failure. The army was wasting away as it marched. At Smolensk, Napoleon faced a critical decision. Should he halt, consolidate, wait for supplies, and resume the campaign the following year? Or should he push on to Moscow, hoping that capturing the ancient Russian capital would force Tsar Alexander to negotiate? He chose to push on. This decision, made in August with months of decent weather ahead, was arguably the campaign's fatal error. Not invading Russia in the first place, that was the strategic mistake, but continuing to Moscow when his logistics were already collapsing was the tactical catastrophe that sealed the army's fate. Here's another thing the general winter myth obscures. The Russians fought brilliantly. Blaming the defeat on weather makes it seem like the Russians won by default, by luck of geography and climate. But the Russian strategy was deliberate, sophisticated, and executed with remarkable discipline. The Russian commander, Mikhail Kutuzov, understood Napoleon's way of war. Napoleon sought decisive battles. He wanted to destroy the Russian army in 1 or 2 major engagements, force a surrender, impose a peace treaty, and return home victorious. This had worked against Austria, Prussia, and Russia itself in previous campaigns. Kutuzov denied him this. The Russians retreated and retreated and retreated. They avoided major battles. They traded space for time. This was psychologically difficult. The Russian nobility and military were furious about abandoning territory without fighting. There was enormous pressure on Kutuzov to stand and fight. But Kutuzov knew something crucial. The deeper Napoleon advanced into Russia, the weaker his army would become. Not because of winter, this strategy was implemented in June, July, and August, but because of the logistical mathematics of 19th century warfare. Every mile Napoleon advanced stretched his supply lines another mile. Every mile meant more wagons needed, more horses required, more soldiers detached to guard the supply route. Meanwhile, the Russian army was falling back toward its own supply bases, getting stronger, gathering reinforcements. The scorched earth policy was brutal but effective. As Russian forces retreated, they destroyed anything that could help the French. Crops were burned, livestock was driven away, villages were evacuated and often set ablaze. When Napoleon's hungry soldiers reached yet another empty, burned town, morale collapsed a little more. Russian partisans, Cossacks and irregular forces harassed French supply columns constantly. They ambushed foraging parties. They cut off stragglers. They made every mile of occupied territory dangerous. The French had to detach more and more troops to guard supply lines and garrison towns, further reducing the combat-effective strength of the main army. When Kutuzov finally did offer battle at Borodino on September 7th, just 75 miles from Moscow, it was on his terms. The Russian army fought from prepared defensive positions. The battle was extraordinarily bloody, perhaps 70,000 casualties combined, and tactically indecisive. Napoleon held the field, but the Russian army withdrew in good order, still intact as a fighting force. Napoleon entered Moscow on September 14th with his army already on the brink of collapse. And then the city burned. Whether Russians set the fires deliberately or they started accidentally remains debated, but the result was catastrophic. Much of Moscow burned to the ground, destroying potential shelter and supplies that Napoleon desperately needed. Napoleon waited in Moscow for over a month, from mid-September to mid-October, expecting Alexander to negotiate. The Tsar never did. He simply refused to acknowledge Napoleon's victory or enter negotiations. This was the final element of Russian strategy, political will. Alexander understood that time was on Russia's side. Winter was coming, yes, but more importantly, Napoleon's army was starving and disease-ridden. All Russia had to do was wait. On October 19th, with no peace offer forthcoming and supplies exhausted, Napoleon finally ordered the retreat from Moscow. This is when the famous winter retreat begins in popular imagination. But remember, the army was already destroyed. Of the 685,000 men who had invaded, fewer than 100,000 remained combat effective. The retreat didn't destroy the Grande Armée, it finished off what was already dying. The retreat from Moscow is where the general winter myth is strongest, so let's look carefully at what actually happened and when. Napoleon's plan was to retreat along a different route than the advance, heading southwest toward Smolensk through fresh territory where foraging might be possible. But Kutuzov's army blocked this route at Maloyaroslavets. A fierce battle on October 24th convinced Napoleon to retreat along the same devastated route he'd advanced on, a route already stripped bare by his own army months earlier. This was a death sentence even without winter weather. The army was marching through territory that had already been thoroughly foraged and scorched. There was no food. There was no shelter. The roads were clogged with abandoned wagons and equipment from the advance. At this point, in late October, the weather was actually still relatively mild. Daytime temperatures were above freezing. It was cold at night, certainly, but not the catastrophic deep freeze of popular imagination. Yet soldiers were already dying in droves. Why? They were starving. Most soldiers were on starvation rations or had no rations at all. Men marching in cold weather need calories, lots of them, to maintain body heat and energy. Without food, the human body quickly breaks down. You become lethargic, confused, unable to function. Your body cannibalizes itself for energy. Soldiers simply collapsed from exhaustion and malnutrition. Discipline was collapsing. When soldiers are starving, military discipline breaks down quickly. Units fragmented. It became every man for himself. Soldiers fought over scraps of food. They killed horses for meat. They looted villages and fought with each other over what little they found. The Grande Armée, once the most disciplined military force in Europe, devolved into a desperate mob. Russian forces harassed them constantly. Cossacks and regular Russian cavalry attacked stragglers, cut off isolated units, and captured supply wagons. Unlike the French, the Russians were well-fed, well-supplied, and operating close to their bases. They picked apart the retreating army like wolves culling in a wounded herd. The retreat reached Smolensk in early November. Soldiers expected to find supplies there. The city was supposed to be a major supply depot. But the magazines were far less full than expected. What supplies existed were inadequate for the army's needs, and much had been pilfered or spoiled. Soldiers rioted, breaking into warehouses and fighting over what little food remained. It was at this point, in mid-November, that winter truly arrived. The temperature plummeted, snow fell, and now, yes, the cold became a major killer. But here's the crucial point. The army was already shattered before the worst cold hit. The cold didn't defeat a functioning army. It killed an army that was already dying. When you're well-fed, properly clothed and in good health, you can survive cold weather. Armies have operated in winter throughout history. But when you're starving, exhausted, sick, wearing worn-out uniforms and broken boots, cold becomes lethal. Your body has no reserves to generate heat. You can't shiver effectively because you lack the calories. You become hypothermic and die. This is what killed tens of thousands during the retreat. Not the cold itself, but the cold combined with starvation, exhaustion, and disease. The weather was the final blow to men who were already at the edge of death. The crossing of the Berezina River in late November became the iconic disaster of the retreat. Russian forces had destroyed the bridges, and Napoleon's engineers had to construct new ones under fire while the army crowded on the western bank. Thousands drowned or were killed by Russian artillery. Thousands more froze while waiting to cross. The panic and chaos were apocalyptic. But again, look at the context. By this point, Napoleon had perhaps 40,000 combat-capable soldiers left from an army of 685,000. The Berezina was horrific, but it was one of many disasters, not the singular catastrophe it's often portrayed as. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée staggered back across the Russian border in mid-December, fewer than 100,000 men remained, and only about 20,000 of those were organized, armed, and capable of fighting. Over 400,000 were dead. 100,000 had been captured. The rest were missing, deserted, or scattered across Russia, many of them dying, even as the survivors escaped. So if winter wasn't the primary culprit, what were Napoleon's actual mistakes? Understanding these reveals far more about military strategy than simply blaming the weather. First, the decision to invade at all. Napoleon invaded Russia to enforce the continental system, his economic blockade of Britain. Russia had been violating the blockade, and Napoleon wanted to force compliance. But was this strategic goal worth the risk of invading the largest country in Europe? With the benefit of hindsight, obviously not. But even at the time, some of Napoleon's advisors warned against it. Second, the size of the army. Napoleon thought overwhelming force would lead to quick victory. But the logistics of supporting 685,000 men in Russia were impossible with 1812 technology. A smaller, more mobile force with realistic supply lines might have fared better. But Napoleon was thinking tactically. How to win battles, not logistically. How to sustain the campaign. Third, underestimating Russian strategy. Napoleon expected the Russians to fight in defense of their territory. When they refused to engage in decisive battle and instead retreated, he didn't adjust his strategy. He kept pursuing, kept pushing deeper, convinced the Russians would eventually be forced to fight on his terms. They never were. Fourth, the failure to halt at Smolensk. This is perhaps the most critical tactical error. At Smolensk in August, it was clear the campaign was in trouble. Supplies were inadequate, disease was rampant, and the Russians showed no sign of surrendering. A prudent commander would have halted, consolidated, built up supply bases, and either waited for the following year or negotiated from a position of strength. Napoleon pushed on to Moscow out of stubbornness and the belief that capturing the capital would force peace. Fifth, staying in Moscow too long. Napoleon waited over a month for peace negotiations that were never coming. Every day in Moscow, his army consumed what little supplies remained while getting weaker and more demoralized. He should have either retreated immediately in mid-September when the weather was still good, or settled in for winter, though the lack of supplies would have made that disastrous too. Sixth, ignoring logistics throughout. Napoleon was a brilliant tactician but often paid insufficient attention to logistics. He assumed problems would sort themselves out, that his genius would compensate for supply shortfalls. In Russia, it didn't. No amount of tactical brilliance could overcome the fundamental problem of feeding an enormous army thousands of miles from home in hostile territory. These weren't failures caused by weather. These were command decisions, strategic errors, and logistical oversights. Blaming General Winter obscures these mistakes and prevents us from learning the real lessons of the campaign. So why does the General Winter myth persist over 200 years later? Why do we still talk about Winter defeating Napoleon when the evidence clearly shows it was only one factor among many? First, Napoleon's own propaganda. After returning to France, Napoleon needed to explain the catastrophic loss of over 500,000 men. Admitting strategic failure would have undermined his authority. Blaming unprecedented winter weather made the disaster seem like an act of God, unfortunate but unavoidable. Napoleon's bulletins and later memoirs emphasized the cold, and this narrative spread. Second, it makes a better story. Winter as antagonist is dramatic and cinematic. Artists could paint stirring scenes of soldiers struggling through blizzards. Writers could describe the cruel cold and nature's indifference to human ambition. It's far more compelling than Napoleon's supply wagons got stuck in mud and his soldiers died of dysentery. Third, it's simpler. The real story of the 1812 campaign is complex, involving logistics, strategy, disease, Russian scorched earth tactics, and yes, also winter. Simplifying it to Winter defeated Napoleon is easier to remember and teach, even if it's not accurate. Fourth, it protects Napoleon's reputation. Napoleon is one of history's most studied military commanders. Acknowledging that he made catastrophic strategic errors in Russia is uncomfortable for those who admire his genius. Blaming Winter preserves the image of Napoleon as a brilliant commander undone by circumstances beyond his control. Fifth, it became part of later historical narratives. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the parallels were obvious. Nazi propaganda initially dismissed concerns about winter, but when Operation Barbarossa stalled and German forces suffered in the cold, the General Winter narrative from Napoleon's time was resurrected. The idea that Russia is unbeatable because of winter became part of Cold War discourse. The myth served political and ideological purposes beyond just explaining Napoleon's defeat. But here's why the myth is actually harmful. It prevents us from learning the real lessons. The 1812 campaign wasn't a story about weather. It was a story about the limits of military power when logistics can't keep up with ambition, the effectiveness of strategic retreat and scorched earth tactics, the importance of understanding your enemy's strategic culture and will to fight, the dangers of escalating commitment, continuing a failing strategy because you've already invested so much, the way disease, hunger, and exhaustion destroy armies more effectively than combat, the critical importance of knowing when to stop, consolidate, and reassess. These lessons apply to military operations today. Modern militaries still struggle with logistics in hostile territory. Leaders still face decisions about whether to push forward or consolidate. Armies still underestimate enemies and overestimate their own capabilities. Blaming winter is easy. Understanding the complex interaction of strategy, logistics, leadership, and circumstances is harder, but it's also far more valuable. The retreat from Moscow in 1812 was one of the greatest military disasters in history. Of the 685,000 men who invaded Russia, fewer than 100,000 returned, and fewer than 20,000 were still combat-capable. It was a catastrophe that shattered Napoleon's reputation for invincibility and began the chain of events that would lead to his abdication and exile. But it wasn't primarily a story about winter weather, despite what popular history tells us. It was a story about catastrophic logistical failure, strategic miscalculation, and underestimating your enemy. The Grande Armée was destroyed during the summer and fall by starvation, disease, desertion, and Russian strategy. Winter killed what was already dying. Napoleon himself bore the primary responsibility. He chose to invade. He chose the size of the invasion force. He chose to push beyond Smolensk. He chose to wait in Moscow. These were command decisions with catastrophic consequences. The Russian strategy of strategic retreat, scorched earth, and refusing to negotiate was brilliant and disciplined. They won not by luck of geography or weather, but by understanding their advantages and Napoleon's vulnerabilities. The myth of General Winter is persistent because it's simple, dramatic, and absolves Napoleon of responsibility. But the real story is far more instructive. It teaches us about the limits of military power, the importance of logistics, the dangers of ignoring warning signs, and the value of knowing when to stop. Winter played a role, yes, but if that's all you take away from the story of Napoleon's retreat, you've missed everything that actually matters. If you enjoyed this deep dive into what really happened during Napoleon's disastrous Russian campaign, let me know in the comments what other historical myths you'd like me to tackle. And if you learned something new, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.